What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another quick video.
Liar!
So I'm going to do a quick formulation video like I've done in the past with some of my other ones. This is actually going to be a reformulation, and the story behind this one is probably 6 months ago I had made a perfume for somebody. She was an older, I would say more refined, woman, and it was for the mature kind of scent, and she didn't really necessarily say what she wanted, but given her age, I went with something really safe, something kind of, not to say springtime, but it was a little on the greener side, a little slightly fruity, but not really. But it was a very traditional, safe women's perfume where it was just pretty flat and boring in my opinion. But it was safe enough for her that she would enjoy it based on her age. There was a ton of Hedione, there was like a ton of like clean white musk and just little tidbits of this and that just to kind of give it some character, but not much. It was just a very clean, basic, generic women's fragrance for somebody that was mature. So I wanted to revisit it because I liked that perfume so much as a good base starting point for a concept that I wanted to do now. So with this one, I've been working on something more now that's going to be a little bit more youthful, something for like a youthful female, geared more for the spring. So some of the concepts I had in mind was, well, when I think of spring, what do I think of? Obviously it's going to be green. It's going to be slightly grassy, slightly leafy. But then some of the other florals that made me think of spring were like violets, iris blooms early in the spring. So I definitely want to incorporate some of that. And then I wanted to give it a touch of sweetness with vanilla and honey. Because when I think of spring, I think of, florals, and then also like little honeybees flying around collecting their honey. So I did want to give it some sweetness with more of a honeyed nuance. So I'm going to go through, like I always do, and just start adding my materials. I'll tell you how many parts per thousand of everything that I'm adding and what my thought process is as I'm adding it to give you an idea, a description of the scent profile that I'm going for. So the overall profile for this, springtime, fresh, floral, green, with some honeyed sweet nuances. But yeah, let's get started. So the first thing, I have everything lined up here. Usually I always work from base, go to the mids, up into the top, and we'll do that as always. So I'm going to start with one of my musks, and this is my musk blend, which is a combination of galaxolide, edenolide, and a touch of exaltalide total. And before I even drop anything, obviously I have to add a beaker. And we'll tear that out. There we go. So as I am doing all this and walking you through and talking and stuff like that, you'll periodically see me jump behind and update my formula as I do this. This one I've been working on for like the past 2 weeks. It's been through many different, not to say versions, but I'm slowly tweaking little nuances here and there to get everything balanced just the way that I want it. So what you're going to be hearing me discuss today is just one of the many trial batches, but it's slowly dialing into something that I'm kind of going for. So with the musk blend, we are at 79 parts per thousand, and that equates roughly in the final perfume. We're looking at almost 8% is going to be this particular musk blend. Now we're going to add some more musk in a little bit later. So the next material is my own sandalwood accord, and this is based on a whole bunch of sandalwood materials like your typical sandalore, bactinol, ebenol, javanol, and things like that, but I've balanced this one out so I have it. Hold on, let me just add in my amount real quick. So I've got this one balanced out, so it's potent enough, but it's still kind of nice and subtly creamy. And let me just see here. On the Sandalwood Accord, we're looking at 15 parts per thousand. And the reason why I like my Sandalwood Accord that I made is, if I keep that Sandalwood Accord roughly at 15 parts per thousand, the amounts in this, like Javanol is definitely in this, and Javanol is strong. So when I have this at roughly 15 parts per thousand in my formula, I know 1 part per thousand is roughly going to be Javanol, which is where you want to keep Javanol typically, because Javanol is super, super strong. Okay, so next is going to be ethyl maltol. And this is what's going to give it some sweetness, and it gives it that kind of, in my opinion, it gives it almost like a youthful vibe because it's that cotton candy, sugary sweetness. And it's pretty strong. So, let me just add that in here. And so let me just update my formula real quick. So with ethyl maltol, I tend to like to keep it at 1 part per thousand. When I start to hover in 2 parts per thousand, it gets pretty noticeable in the overall blend, and it gives it this very candied vibe. So I'm going for, I want it sweet, but not super, you know, like you're sucking on a lollipop sweet. So 1 part per thousand of ethyl maltol seems to do real nice. Next, we are going to add in Honey Signature from Firmenich. And Honey Signature is, if you want a honey note, just a standalone single material honey note, Honey Signature is where it's at. You don't need anything more than that. So I am at 1 part per thousand for Honey Signature. It's a strong material. I treat it in the same way of like ethyl maltol. If 1 part per thousand is pretty good to give it a nice honeyed nuance note, 2 parts per thousand is a very noticeable honey note. Anything higher than that, it's like, holy crap, this is pretty honey smelling. So 1 part per thousand for Honey Signature. Next, we're going to do good old classic Fixator 505E. And this guy, just see where we're at here, is a softer shade of Ambroxan, in my opinion. It has that kind of Ambroxan-y vibe, but just a touch softer shade of it. So you can go a little bit, not to say heavy-handed with it, but you can go a few parts per thousand of this in your formula and it's not going to overtake anything. But let me just update this. So Fixator 505E, I've got it 5 parts per thousand in this formula. Now for the next one, to piggyback on that, we have good old Ambroxan. And Ambroxan is just a touch stronger than Fixator 505E. And for me, this one typically is a good material. It's a classic material for modern day men's colognes, highly dosed in Ambroxan nowadays. But in a woman's perfume, I find that just a little bit gives it a cleanse, like almost like a sweet cleanliness and a little bit of exalting kind of vibe without it imparting too much of a smell. So on here, let me just update the formula. I am at 15 parts per thousand, so roughly 1.5% of this formula is Ambroxan. Modern day men's colognes can go up to like 5, 6, 7, 8% ambroxan, and then it's very noticeable. But 1.5% ambroxan in this seems to work really, really well. Now to get into some sweeter side of things, ethyl vanillin. We're going to add some regular vanillin in a little bit, but we'll start with the ethyl vanillin first. And ethyl vanillin to me is pretty strong. At least to my nose, it's super, super noticeable at low doses. Some of my previous formulations of this very same one, I had the ethyl vanillin up pretty high just to see what it would do. And I noticed after 1 hour of the dry down, the vanillin scent really kicked in pretty strong. And it kind of turned the fragrance from a classic, floral, fresh green into more of like a gourmand, almost slightly sweet gourmand green floral, which is what I didn't want. I wanted some sweetness, but not enough to change the overall profile to a different direction. So with ethyl vanillin, we're at 1 part per thousand. And the next material is a new one that I just got and I'm kind of toying with, is a Dreamwood Base by Firmenich, and it's yet another sandalwood material. There's hundreds and hundreds of sandalwood materials out there, it seems. So I'm kind of just toying with this a little bit to see what it would do in the blend, because I've noticed Dreamwood Base is very subtle to me as far as a sandalwood note, which is good. Because if I had my original sandalwood accord at 15 parts per thousand, if I want to amp up the sandalwood without it being overly noticeable, the Dreamwood Base works pretty good because it's more of a subtle sandalwood. It's very soft in my opinion. It never really truly gets in the way. It adds a nice kind of creaminess overall without screaming sandalwood. So Dreamwood Base, we are at 7 parts per thousand. Next up is good old CASHMERAN. And I'm using CASHMERAN to give it more of a texture rather than a scent. Because I like CASHMERAN in a sense of, if you use a lot of it, you get that kind of musky, slightly pine scent from it. But if you use just enough, just a little bit, it gives it this pillowy texture like a musk would, without it smelling like musk. It just gives it this very soft, pillowy cashmere-like vibe if you go pretty low with it. So with CASHMERAN, we are at, let me just update this formula real quick. Okay, CASHMERAN, 6 parts per thousand. Anything higher than that, I've noticed I had it pretty high in the other trial batches, and I've noticed as it dries down, the CASHMERAN took over and it got too pillowy, just too fuzzy smelling. And I lowered the CASHMERAN down now to 6 parts per thousand. Works like a dream. Then we're gonna sweeten it up a touch with some coumarin, but not a lot, just enough to just sweeten it up just a touch in a gourmand way, but not enough to actually smell it in the overall finished formula. So coumarin is at 1 part per thousand, and I like it. 1 part per thousand gives it this nice shade of dark sweetness. When you start to get into 2 to 3 parts per thousand, you start to smell it as tonka bean. And then, so we've got another white musk, ethylene brassylate. And I toyed around with different musks. The very first musk we added in was my musk blend, which is galaxolide, edenolide, and a few other things. But it's primarily a sweet, clean musk. And I've tried some other musk blends in with this, and it seems like any other different kind of musk that I use in this formula overall turned it too dark. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna stick to another clean white musk, but something slightly fruity, which is ethylene brassylate. So ethylene brassylate is at 30 parts per thousand. So combining ethylene brassylate with my original musk blend, if anyone's wondering what's the total amount of musk I'm using overall in this, we are looking at roughly 11% is going to be musks in this overall formula. And I've noticed when I go past 12%, it gets too heavy for this fragrance. And the fragrance for this I wanted was more clean, floral, light, refreshing, semi-green, slightly fruity, slightly gourmand, honeyed. Too much musk just gave it too much weight, and I didn't like that, so I'm keeping the total musk roughly 11%. And then the last in the base, we're going to add regular old vanillin. And vanillin, let me just update this sheet. Is at 2 parts per thousand. So total combined vanillins with regular vanillin at 2 parts per thousand, ethyl vanillin at 1 part per thousand. It's not very vanillic, but there's enough vanilla in here to give it a nice warm sweetness in the base that doesn't necessarily come to the forefront until you get to the very, very later stages of the dry down. Okay, so that was pretty much all the base. Moving on to the heart and the mids. We're gonna go with standard old ISO-E Super. Okay, so ISO-E Super is quite high in this. About, we'll say 160 parts per thousand. So we're looking at almost 16% is ISO-E Super in this formula. Next up, Hedione. But this is the Hedione HC version from Firmenich. There's many different types of HC versions of Hedione. I'm just using the standard old Hedione HC from Firmenich. And this one, let me just update the formula. We are roughly at 142 parts per thousand, so roughly 14.2% is Hedione HC. Now next up is Lilial. And Lilial, with so much controversy as far as it being banned in the UK, it's going to be banned shortly here in the US. I'm still using it and I love it. I've got different other Lilial alternatives. For the time being, I'm going to continue to use it until it's completely banned altogether. But there is an IFRA restriction. So with Lilial though, let me just add this in. With Lilial in this formula, I'm pushing it to the max, right to the point of almost being IFRA restricted, but it is below, so it's safe. But I'm trying to push it to the max because when I think spring, Lily of the Valley is one of those notes that is very, very spring-like. They bloom in the spring along with other, iris, violet leaf and things like that. So Lily of the Valley note in this formula is going to be very important. So we're going to do Lilial at 120 parts per thousand, which is roughly 12% of the formula is Lilial, which is a lot. But depending on what the overall finished final perfume concentration is going to be, it still meets IFRA restrictions at that point. IFRA restrictions on this is 1.4% of your finished completed perfume can't be more 1.4% of Lilial. But if you do roughly like a 10 to 12% EDT, I'll be safe. If I push it to a 15% EDP concentration, I'm going to be right there at that cap, where it's probably at the risk of being over the IFRA restriction. Next up is your typical cis-3 hexanol salicylate, which is a green material, slightly floral shaded. And I'm adding just a touch of this because I do want some greenness to come through in this perfume, because when I think spring, I think floral and I think green. So that's just one of the green materials. As we go through the rest of these, some other green materials are going to come through. And on that one, we're at 16 parts per thousand for cis-3 hexanol salicylate. Next up, Myol, which is another lily of the valley material. Not as nice as Liliol, but it's not as IFRA restricted. So the reason why I took Liliol to the cap, where I think I can use it right up to that IFRA restriction point, and I still want more Lily of the Valley to come through in this perfume. So now I'm switching to Myol to kind of take it just over the edge a little bit. Now Myol is IFRA restricted, but you can use up to 4.7% of Myol in your finished perfume and still be safe. So we're not even coming close to that. So the combination of the Myol with the Liliol, everything's IFRA compliant, and I'm getting the Lily of the Valley note that I really want. And let me just update this formula real quick. So with Myol, we are at 57 parts per thousand, which is roughly 5.7% of the concentrate is Myol. Now, moving on to some florals here. I wasn't sure if I wanted to lean more violet or if I wanted to lean more iris. The scent profile of those two notes are kind of one and almost the same. Violet to me is a little bit more sweet fruity in a sense of you get this banana kind of vibe with it. Iris is a little bit more rooty and powdery, but I've made a pre-made accord here that's just based on all the different ionones and irones and things like that, and I have it balanced so it leans right in the middle where it's not too violet, it's not too irisy, it's kind of right in the middle. So with some other materials, I can take this into whichever direction I want it to go. So this is a good starting point for my, hold on, let me add this here. It's a good starting point for this perfume to lean into the iris violet territory without swaying in either direction. And with this, we are at 33 parts per thousand, so just roughly over 3% of the formula is going to be irisy violety notes. To help push some of the florals, to give it a little bit more exalting kind of sweetness. Damascone Alpha, love this material. It is IFRA restricted though. So I tend to love to use this and push it to the max before it gets to that restriction point. So Damascone Alpha, 3 parts per thousand. So we're roughly at 0.3% Damascone Alpha just in the concentrate alone. But if you're making like a 10 or 12% EDP, you're only at 0.03%. Of Damascone Alpha in the overall perfume as a whole, and IFRA restrictions on that I believe is 0.042%, so we're safe. And Damascone Alpha just gives us freshness, this kind of nice bloom of freshness with a sweet, kind of like a slight apple connotation, which is what I want, because in the further down we go here, I'm going to add in some apple. So that one just kind of makes sense to add. Now, this next material I have a love-hate relationship with, and this is called Berry Floral. Berry Floor, and I forget who makes it. Maybe it's IFF, maybe it's Firmenich, I forget. But Berry Floor is, to me, it's like another, not to say it's Hedione, but it's very, very light and transparent like Hedione, so you can go heavy-handed with this, and it really doesn't really make itself known in your perfume, but it does give it this nice, soft, transparent floral bed to sit in, but it does have like a red berry sweet nuance to it. So I thought that was a nice touch for this. So with Berry Floor, we're going to add in, let me just add this in real quick. And let me update the formula. So 50 parts per thousand for Berry Floor, which means 5% is going to be Berry Floor in the Perfume's concentrate. And somebody might think 5% is a lot for a single material, but not for Berry Floor, because Berry Floor is so subtle. It's so, like when you smell it from the bottle, when I first bought it, I couldn't smell anything. It took me a while to pick up on the nuances of it. Even now, I can still barely smell it. So I know I can go heavy-handed in this, and it just adds a nice subtle floral with a touch of berry nuance, which is still very undetectable in this, but it just, I treat it like it's another version of Hedione, so to speak. Next up, Aldehyde C14, which is the peachy kind of scent. And for women's perfumes, I love to add just a touch of peach nuance, especially if I'm using sandalwood notes, because it helps give it a little bit of sweet creaminess. So we are at 3 parts per thousand for Aldehyde C14 Peach. Next up is Mirac Aldehyde. Now, of all the other aldehydes out there, this one leans more citrusy to me. Kind of orangey, grapefruit, zesty, but still that typical aldehydic where it's got that kind of hot iron, linened, brightening effect. And with this, it's super, super strong, just like any other aldehyde is. And I don't want to add a lot to give it a scent. I'm just giving it enough to give it or impart like a feel. So Mirac Aldehyde is at 1 part per thousand, and I would never go any higher than, 1 part per thousand of any aldehyde, so to speak. Next up is, I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, but I think it's called Perfume, and it's another violet material, and I forget who makes this. I think Firmenich makes this, and this is supposed to smell like Parma violets. And this is what I mean by, I started off with my Iris Violet Accord that was kind of neutral, not too iris, not too violet, and I can take it whatever direction I want. So now I'm going to take it into that violet-y direction by adding I can't even say it, Perfume, I think it's called. My pronunciation sucks when it comes to some of these materials. So we're just going to add just a little bit. It's pretty strong. It's really strong, actually. And I'm at 3 parts per thousand. And I've had it in my other blends where I was at 5 parts per thousand, and it really took it into a Parma violet direction, and the banana nuance kind of really stuck out. And that's when I knew I was using too much of that, because I kept getting whiffs of this sweet banana. And I was like, I have to lower that. So 3 parts per thousand was that sweet spot for me in this perfume. Now we're going to open it up with a little bit of melanol, which is an ozonic kind of aquatic material with hints of melon. So with melanol, It smells a lot to me like cologne or cologne, but the melon nuance is more pronounced. And with this, we are at 1 part per thousand. With most ozonic materials like melanol, cologne, cologne, I generally stay at 1 to 2 parts per thousand and never anything higher. Then it gets really obvious. So 1 part per thousand helped open this up to give it a nice, not to say wet aquatic feel, but it opened it up in a way where it kept it fresh. Now, this material, IFF makes honey meal olefac. And to me, when I first bought it, I hated it. But now it fits this perfume perfectly. And let me just add this in here. And the reason why I hated it when I first got it was I couldn't get past this dandelion, like wild dandelion honeyed smell. It's very, let me just update this formula real quick and tell you. It's at 37 parts per thousand, so 3.7% of the concentrate is honey meal olefac. It works great for this perfume because, like I said, I wanted a honeyed nuance. So this kind of takes the honey signature from Formulation and it just takes it up a notch a little bit. But because it has a floral, it's a combination of both floral, I smell it as dandelions. It's floral and honeyed. So it just kind of worked really well in this. I had it much higher in previous earlier batches, but when I got to the 30 minute mark of the dry down, it just came off as so honeyed, like so honey. It almost smelled like waxy honey, like it was just like smacking you in the face. So I lowered this down a touch. So roughly about 3.5% of the concentrate is honey meal olefac. And that's probably still just a little bit too much honey for my taste, but it's working pretty good in this formula at that ratio. Probably the next 3 or 4 trial batches I do in the next days or so, I may end up lowering that a little bit, but for now, I kind of like it at that ratio right there. Okay, moving on to the top notes. Oh, I'm sorry. We've got one more to add. One more middle note. And it's a new one that I just recently acquired from, I think it's from IFF. It's called Salicylate, and it's just another salicylate. So it's kind of a generic white floral, semi-sweet material, and it fits the theme perfectly for this, which is just, I wanted a generic white floral to go with my Lily of the Valley. And on this, it's at 14 parts per thousand, so roughly 1.4% of the concentrate is salicylate. Okay, now moving on to the top notes. Not too many top notes with this. I'm going to go heavy-handed with bergamot oil, which is the BFB or whatever, I can't even talk today, Bergatin free or whatever. It's the safer version of bergamot. So you can go a little bit heavier handed with this and not worry about skin sensitization or skin irritation. So on this formula, it's going to seem like a lot, but it's still a safe amount because it is a bergamotin reduced version of bergamot. So let me update this formula. Tons and tons of bergamot, 72 parts per thousand. So we're looking at roughly almost a little over 7% of the overall perfume's concentrate is bergamot. And I wanted that because I needed that freshness in the opening. And it works. Bergamot's always worked for me, and I stick with it. Next material is undercavital. And for this one, I chose this because it has violet leaf like greenness with a slightly ozonic twist. So the violet leaf again plays well with the iris violet notes that we've already added in. Let me just update this formula. We are at 8 parts per thousand of undercavitol, so 0.8% of the perfume formula. Next up, good old linalool. Got to have me some linalool. And I'm just adding a little bit of this in just to give it the top end just a little bit more freshness and a nondescript kind of like a floral, like a little floral freshness without it actually smelling like a floral. And that is at 28 parts per thousand, so about 2.8% of the concentrate is linalool. Okay. Let's now move into something different. So when I think spring, I still think brisk, fresh, crisp air. And we've already added in some, aldehydes, muriatic aldehyde, some melanol to give it some ozonic materials, but I wanted something to give it just a touch of crispness that kind of tingles your nose a little bit, like that crisp, not to say wintry air, but when you're on the cusp of spring, it still has that cold air vibe. And wintergreen mint essential oil kind of does the trick. So we are going to add just a little bit, but not enough to actually make it smell minty, just enough to give it a very discreet, tingly, crisp sensation without it smelling minty. And with wintergreen, let me just update this, is at 1 part per thousand, so roughly 0.1% of the formula is wintergreen mint oil. Now moving on to another green material, and this is, I think Formulation makes this. This is a Ivy base, and I love this material. Let me just add this in real quick. And what I like about Ivy base, let me just update the formula real quick. It's at 3 parts per thousand, so 0.3% of the concentrate is Ivy base. And what I like about Ivy base, it gives a sense of green foliage, but it's not sharp, penetrating, piercing green. It's softer. It's much softer. It's a nice, soft, almost like a velvety greenness that never really gets in the way and turns your perfume too green. But it does give a hint of greenness to it, which is what I wanted, hence the spring theme of the perfume. And it does nice at 3 parts per thousand. Now moving on to some Verdot, which is a widely used woody material with some apple nuance. And for me, Verdot works good if you have an apple note in the top and if you have some woods in the base. Verdot is a nice bridge to carry on from, apple crisp down to the base. So Verdot, we're at 28 parts per thousand, so roughly 2.8% of the perfume concentrate is Verdot. Next up, an apple accord. Now this is one of my own made apple accords. I forget what's in it. I know there's some manzanate, there's some apple olfactory from IFF, and there's something from Robert Tett, I think makes a apple base, and I've kind of blended them up in a way where I felt it was the most natural smelling to me. So with apple, let me just add this in. It just gives it a nice crisp bite, a nice crisp fruity bite to the top. And not a lot though, we're not gonna add a lot. We're actually gonna be at, let me update this. So 13 parts per thousand, which is roughly 1.3% dedicated to the apple note. Next up, Paul Killer's Perky Pear Base. I like saying that, Perky Pear. And this is a pretty good pear base. Let me just add this in real quick. That has a nice bite to it. When I think of pear, I think of juicy with a little, some pears have kind of like, well, depending on what kind of pear, it could have the velvety skin, it could have the crisp green pear hard skin. His leans more towards green pear that's got a little bit of crisp bite to it, which is kind of great for this theme, hence the springtime crisp clean, you know, vibe that I'm going for. The perky pear does add a nice pear note that still has just enough bite to cut through without smelling too wet and juicy. And we are at, with the perky pear base, 13 parts per thousand, so 1.3% of the concentrate will be perky pear base. And I found that it works great in this blend. I don't know what it is, but pear, apple, with a little bit of green top is a great springtime opener for like a female's springtime fragrance. Almost done, just a couple more materials here. I wanted to add in just a touch of sulfuric fruitiness, some cassis, and with all the different cassis materials out there, let me just add this in real quick. I ended up going with Cassifix from IFF because I felt like that one was the lighter of the cassis materials that I've tried. I know I think Firmenich makes cassis base, which is a very prominent fruity, in-your-face, juicy blackberry red, you know, kind of currant smell. Cassifix is that same smell, but it's toned down, so you can use just enough just to give it a little bit more berry sweetness, but without it actually coming out as in the perfume as, you know, here I am, I have, you know, black currant buds. So with this, let me just update this formula here. That's good. It's at 5 parts per thousand, so about 0.5% of the concentrate is Cassifix, and that just adds a nice little berried blackberry note. And methyl pamplemousse is, for me, it's a great material if you have an existing citrus in your perfume or your formula, which I do. I've got bergamot. Methyl pamplemousse kind of works. It's supposed to be more of like a grapefruit note, which it is. It smells more grapefruit than anything. Let me update this formula real quick. But with methyl pamplemousse, we're at 15 parts per thousand, so 1.5% of the concentrate is methyl pamplemousse. It adds a nice zing to the top note. Because I've got so much bergamot in this, and the methyl pamplemousse is tucked under low, it gives it the zing without coming across as grapefruit. So, and that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted something just a little bit more piercing, a little bit more zingy in the top opening. The last material, we are going to end it on a green note. Standard cis-3-hexanol, the standard one, which is the green grassy material. Now with this, I've noticed, I've had this in a batch, a trial batch prior to this one. So let me update this real quick. And so in this one, we're going to keep it low, 1 part per thousand. In the trial batch I've had before this, I've had it at 2 parts per thousand, but what I've noticed with cis-3-hexanol, yes, it's green and grassy, but it has an oiliness to it. And it smells like freshly cut grass. Like if you ever had a lawnmower and you're mowing your lawn, you've got a bag full of grass clippings and you dip your hand and grab the grass and you feel how damp and wet and oily that is. That to me is what cis-3-hexanol is. It's the damp, oily, wet grass. The last formulation I had prior to this had it at 2 parts per thousand, and I noticed in the opening immediately had this oiliness to it. It had the grassiness that I wanted, maybe just a hair too much, but the oiliness stuck out, so I was like, okay, I need to lower that. Now we're at 1 part per thousand. I don't know what it smells like yet, but that is pretty much it. That is the complete perfume as this trial is going to be. So we went from base, mid to top. I gave you my thoughts on what material I'm using and why, the amounts, and I told you what the theme of the perfume is, the vibe that I'm going for. This is probably trial 6 or 7 so far, and with many of my other perfumes I can go as many as 20 to 30 different trials until I get satisfied with something. So I'm still in the early stages of this one, but I'm liking where it's going right now. This batch was mostly made just so I can tone down the oily grassiness in the opening. So we'll see what happens. So I'm gonna let this sit. I'll fill up this little sprayer, let the sprayer sit for 24 to 48 hours, and I'll spray it on my skin, see how it smells. I'll spray it on other people's skin, see how it reacts to their, you know, pH, skin chemistry, and the differences. And I'm gonna just take it from there and make adjustments as needed. So far, I'm liking what I smell. And yeah, so that's it. That's another quick formulation walkthrough of one of the many trials that I'm going to have with this particular perfume that I'm going to be doing. Okay, so with that being said, until next time.